In this episode, we are joined by Jason Hettler, who is the speed and agility coach at IMG Academy down in Bradenton, Florida. This episode is packed. Honestly, we talked about things such as the warm-up, the types of things that he looks for in the warm-up, what some of those things that he sees might actually tell him. We also get into some of Jason's work on the role of feedback in motor learning, specifically sensory feedback, auditory feedback, and we talk about different ways to be a facilitator versus a director. This episode is packed. Like I said, Jason's got a ton of good information, and he's got a ton of information that he's really, really good at articulating and communicating. So I think you guys will enjoy it. So here we go. Let's get it going. Welcome to the Samson Strength Coach Collective podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Grasso. We are joined today by Jason Hettler, who is the speed and agility coach at IMG Academy. And IMG down in where in Florida is that?
Bradenton, Florida. So
Bradenton,
just a little
Florida.
bit south of Tampa.
Nice. So pretty warm down there, I'm assuming. I'm looking at snow right now, so you're probably in a little bit better position than I am.
I spent 7 hours on the beach on Sunday playing volleyball, soaking up the sun. So it's a good spot.
Nice. That's awesome. That's really, really nice of you to rub that in my face. And I actually went snowboarding for the first time this past Sunday. So I spent almost 5 to 6 hours on a mountain. So it's, beach or mountain, I think is one of those questions people ask. And I think, you get a little bit of both. You're in a good place.
For sure. And just to get outside on the weekend, it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, welcome. We're very appreciative. You're obviously about to have your first child. So I know this is some crazy times right now. I really appreciate you hopping on. Just to give you guys a little bit of background on Jason, he has his bachelor's in exercise science from Grand Valley State University. He is a certified strength and conditioning specialist through the NSCA. He was the performance and innovation manager at Altis from 2014 to 2020. He was also with the Chinese Olympic Committee, where he was the head strength and conditioning coach for the national sprint team from 2019 to 2020. And he was with Triathlon Canada as the strength, power, and movement coach. Prior to that, he was strength and conditioning intern at Western Michigan. So those are the credentials and all of the places, but obviously those are just the names and that's just the surface. So we want to dive a little bit deeper into you, Jason, and kind of where you've been and what, some of these places have meant to you along your journey. So if you wouldn't mind just kind of taking us all the way back to the start, where did this whole journey start? Why did it start, right? And how did it lead into where you're at now with IMG and what you guys are trying to accomplish there?
Yeah, for sure. I'll try to run through it kind of quick because I can get a little bit long-winded with it. But I tore my ACL my senior year of high school. And so I didn't realize it at the time, but I just ended up doing a lot of kind of helping out, coaching the team as I was injured. And fast forward a couple of years, that really just kind of sat in the background as I started university pursuing a finance degree. And I worked 3 years entry-level accounting in a cubicle. And I'm surprised it took me 3 years to figure it out, but that wasn't the life for me. Fortunately, I was just community college at that point, so I hadn't blown too much money going in a different route. So I switched over to exercise science, did a little bit of coaching while I was pursuing that finance degree, mostly basketball, sport coaching as opposed to anything S&C. Just that was my first love growing up. And with that injury, it just kind of made sense. And I just kind of rolled into that. But never really thought that it was something I was going to pursue full time until suffering through 3 years in a cubicle. And so then I knew I wanted to get something a lot more dynamic. I knew I loved sport and I loved coaching basketball, but I didn't want to just coach basketball. And so that really led me into strength and conditioning, with my mindset at that time being that it'd be an avenue to work with a lot of different sports. And I enjoyed, training in the weight room, but it wasn't a huge part of my life at that time. But I knew it was something that I could get on board with and enjoy that lifestyle. As crazy as that sounds probably to some, when it's an interesting lifestyle at times. Yeah. So I went that route, got the internship at Western Michigan. And my mentor there, Kyle Skinner, he pointed me in the direction of what at the time was World Athletic Center and is now Altis. I was looking for a GA position after my undergrad, couldn't find anything. Not that I couldn't find anything, I couldn't land anything. Yeah. I sent out tons of applications and everything. But so I had some time after graduation with my undergrad and I was fortunate to get an internship at World Athletic Center, Phoenix, Arizona at the time. So went out there for 7 weeks. And then I just got lucky. Honestly, it was good timing. They needed some more help. So they brought me on. That first year, kind of like as an apprentice type role, real low pay, personal training mornings and evenings around it, but just soaking it all up, learning a ton about the sport of track and field, the weight room, sprinting, everything. So that was fantastic. And that just kept snowballing, and I stayed there for 6 years.
Yeah.
And it was while I was there that I'd say I transitioned I started as strength and power coach there, and transitioned really to a lot more of my role being on the track. And then kind of leading into sort of that speed and agility role now. But it was also the place that afforded me the opportunity to go to some of those other spots. So it was while I was at Altis that I was able to kind of contract out with the Chinese national team, contract out with Triathlon Canada, and some of those other roles that you mentioned. So I really owe a lot of my growth and development to Altis and what they provided in that environment. And then IMG called with an opening, and it just felt like a good time to switch things up. I'd spent a lot of time with professional track and field, Major League Baseball, these different groups that were mentioned. And it was time for me to branch out and try to apply some of that into a new environment. And IMG provides that. 1,300 youth athletes, plus pro training camps and different things that come in. I was salivating from the beginning at the opportunity to take what we've been doing and what I had learned, try to adapt it essentially into a new environment, step away from my mentors a little bit and really kind of dive in that way. So that's a big part of what led me to IMG, and now it's been about 13 months out here in Florida.
Yeah, it's awesome. Well, welcome back to the East Coast. I know it's get a little crazy out there on the West Coast at times, but we're welcome back. What would you say? I mean, obviously, we kind of talked about this before we started the podcast. Obviously, you spent 6 years at Altis, and then you're afforded the opportunity to get some exposure with these other places and these other programs. And what would you say in your initial stages at IMG? Not even so much now, but in those first 2 to 3 months, for some of the things that you were like, okay, I'm prepared for this because of what I took from Altis and some of these other places. Like, what were some of the specific scenarios where you could say, yeah, okay, I'm ready for this because of this? Like, what were some of those major things that you took, probably those big rocks that you think you took from Altis that prepared you for the initial stages of taking on some of the tasks you came across at IMG in those first couple months?
I'd say two things come to mind initially. One thing that always stuck out to me from probably day one at Altis was the intentionality of all the coaches, their ability to justify every single thing that they did during the 4 or 5 hours that they were with the athletes, from the programming, the sets and the reps, to the exercise selection, to the rest, to the manual therapy inputs, to the nutritional supplementation protocols. Everything had a very specific purpose, and that was it was just really enlightening, because I don't know that was really instilled into me prior to that. I think a lot of the formal education, it just seems to kind of brush past some of that, or maybe you just get caught up in certain aspects of whether it be the programming or whatnot, and then you start throwing some things together and you start to lose track of some of those objectives and justifications. At least that's the route I felt I was going. So it was really great for me to be exposed to just this deep intentionality with everything that was going on. And that carried into probably the warm-ups is the best example. I'll be honest, my time prior to Altis and in different collegiate environments, it was at times it was athletes would sort of warm up on their own while coaches were on the side talking about the session or whatever it may be, and then come together and execute from there. Very different at Altis. We're very stuck into the warm-up, watching all the movement, making adjustments if we need to, understanding if what we're seeing in the warm-up might affect the session that's to come after it. So all those pre-brief meetings, all those meetings to discuss the day would happen well in advance of the warm-up to make sure that we were all eyes, all hands on deck for that warm-up. So I kind of lump that into one. The other big experience that sticks out is my first time working with any of the Major League Baseball groups. My first time with that, I forget which team it was, but I found myself talking to them the same way that I was talking to the professional sprinters, saying a lot of the same things, and probably assuming a certain level of understanding or knowledge or competence. And I was faced with a lot of blank stares looking back at me, and and it wasn't something that oh yeah, it still happens to this day, but
yeah,
I'm working on it.
yeah,
And it took me a week or two of a couple days a week with them to really figure out that I was the problem. And it wasn't just because they were bad at sprinting or any of those things. It was I was not doing a good job of coaching them and communicating with them and connecting with them, meeting them where they were at.
sure,
And so that was a great experience for me to realize that, I have been working with a very homogenous population in professional sprinters. And if I'm going to take what we do and adapt it and apply it into other environments, the same has to go for my coaching and my language and the cues and the communication that I give. And it probably seems obvious, and it probably sounds obvious right now, but to me it wasn't. And so I started off beating my head against the wall, and fortunately it just took a week or two to realize that I was the problem, and was able to really grow from that. And so those are two big takeaways that have really stuck with me and will always stick with me.
yeah, absolutely. And I think you make a great point. And I'll just touch on the last point you made before I go back to the warm up stuff. I think that's it's interesting you mentioned that, because I feel like I've seen stuff recently, and obviously I think just working in the world of collegiate sport, professional sport, whatever it is, just working with strength coaches or coaches in general. I think we've all been around coaches who try to figure out a way to put fault or blame the athlete, not even just find a way, but it might just be like inherently within their nature. They, if something's not going well, it's because the talent isn't good enough, or the athlete isn't prepared enough to be able to give them what they're looking for their training session or for their practice or whatever the case may be. And I think, I'm glad you point that out, that you were able to take a look in the mirror and obviously humble yourself in the sense of say, okay, well, where like, how much ownership can I truly take over this situation? Like, can I exhaust all of the options that are possible to exhaust in order to figure out what actually is the problem here, right? In terms of like ownership over your own responsibility of the situation. And I think, a lot of situations you see it all the time is like, oh, like I set up this particular training session, or I try to provide the athlete with this particular stimulus, but they are unable to execute something like, I don't know, whatever exercise or, drill, if you will. Right. And it's like, it's the athlete. You see, like, we just don't have the athletes. We just don't have the guys that do this, that kind of thing. And I think you were obviously referring to a little bit more of a communication situation, right? It's like how you were communicating and articulating your thoughts, obviously, and you're able to clean that up. So I do think that is important, and I think that that's something that a lot of coaches could probably take a little bit more of a deeper dive into. Is like, okay, when something isn't going well, I know people talk all the time, like, yeah, like take ownership, but like what it truly means to take ownership is to try to literally figure out any and every possible way that this particular situation could be your fault, and it is your fault, prior to obviously going and figuring, trying to push the blame off onto the athlete. And it's not to say that we haven't worked with athletes sometimes who are just simply not capable. Trust me, there's no shortage of those. But obviously at the at the crux of it, the concept and the principle is, hey, you are the coach, you are the teacher, you are the guider, right? Like the athlete is trusting you, their parents are trusting you to figure out a way to be creative enough and flexible enough to meet the athlete where they're at, to get them to where they need to go. And if you can't, figure out a way to take ownership over that and take blame. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. But I do want to go back to what you mentioned about the warm up, because this is something that we've touched on a couple of times, kind of come up in a couple of the podcasts I've done. It's like, what is actually taking place during the warm up? I talked with Jordan Nusma at Elon, and I interviewed him a couple of weeks ago, and the warm up came up again, obviously his book and everything. And I was like, okay, so like, what exactly like is this situation revolving around the warm up, right? Like we all believe that the warm up is important, but it's something more than just simply increasing your core temperature. Okay. And now you're talking specifically about how that warm up guided some of your thoughts and ideas and adjustments that you would need to make for your training session. Right. And I think that that's always something crucial. I think like one example I try to give to people and to coaches when the one that always comes to mind is like, well, if you're going through some power speed drills in your warm up and you notice that like maybe ground contact times are a little bit longer and some of these things that they typically are, that might be an indicator that, hey, maybe the CNS isn't really loving what's going on right now. And it kind of needs a little massaging or whatever to kind of adjust what's going on. That's like one example, but I would love to hear from you. And I'm glad you brought that up. What are some of the things that you were looking for in that warm up when you've emphasized, obviously the warm up is super important to pay attention to because it could dictate some of the decisions that are made heading into that training session and have to alter what has been planned?
Yeah. The first one that probably comes to mind, and it might have been unique to us because I realized that a lot of listeners probably have a certain duration of time that they have to squeeze a warm up into. But we didn't. We just had a set list of drills and exercises that we would repeat quite regularly. And so one thing that we could look at was the duration. How long does it take an athlete to go through this? And then, at the beginning of the year, beginning of the training in the fall for us, it's going to be kind of long. It's an extensive warm up and they're not in great shape. So you have to take that into account. But if we can start to understand sort of what their normal duration of that warm up is, and then if they're deviating away from that, then that can give us some insight. So if it's taking a lot longer, they might be pretty fatigued. Might be, it might be worth digging into a little bit more. And if they equally, really, if they blow through it and get it done really quick, it could be because they're fatigued, or it could be because they feel great and they're just firing on all cylinders and got it in. So it's not that it necessarily gives us a black and white clue, but it gives us an idea of, maybe a deeper conversation should be had as we dial things in. You mentioned the ground contact. I'd say range of motion, technical execution would come along right with both of those things. With sprint drills, we'd incorporate a lot of different A drill variations, challenge coordination in a lot of different ways. So that could be pretty telling. And then we might use it just to simply adjust volumes, intensities, and densities. Or one way that I really like to think about it is, how close are we going to hold them to a specific technical model? And if it's a day where they feel really good and we think the fatigue might be pretty low, then maybe we make a leap there and we say, maybe their risk of injury is a little bit lower. So maybe we can let them explore their movement expression a little bit broader than if they were restricted range of motion, slept poorly, excessive fatigue. Then, with the idea being that a stricter technical model is probably safer if we can get on board with that idea. Then in those instances, we may say, okay, we want to hold this athlete to a pretty strict technical model today. Because if they go too far outside of that, then we might be holding our breath and crossing our fingers. And we don't ever want to be in a position where we're holding our breath and crossing our fingers when somebody's sprinting.
Yeah,
so understanding the technique and their own individual style and when we might allow a little bit more leeway for that movement expression.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great answer. I appreciate that. So to summarize that up, I guess to be a little bit more rigid and to kind of stick to this technical model when you feel like some of the things that you're seeing in the warm-up might lead you to believe that, hey, there might be some things going on in the athlete's personal life, maybe not great. The sleep wasn't as great last night. I don't know how often you dealt with study habits and things like that. Obviously, working with professional athletes who may not involved in school, but if we're working with a collegiate athlete, maybe it's midterms, whatever the case may be, trying to stick to that little more of a technical model to try to put some constraints, I guess, on what would be capable of that athlete. If you're seeing some of those things like a lack of range of motion, ground contact time, and then some of the other like technical execution or lack thereof, right? And then obviously if you do see some of those things and you see that there's great range of motion, great ground contact time, great technical execution, there's a general vibrant attitude from the athlete, then maybe kind of like lowering the barriers on that a little bit and allowing the training session to, like you said, and I like the word explore that you use. I think that that's a really good way to describe allowing the athlete to kind of, see where they can go with their capabilities on that particular day. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I often will use kind of an anchor analogy with it. So imagine you're in a boat and you're going to drop the anchor. You might allow a really long chain on that anchor if the weather's nice, if there's no traffic around. Allow that boat to explore around that anchor a little bit more so.
Yeah.
Whereas opposed to if the storm's blowing in or if you're near a marina, you're going to shorten that chain.
Sure.
If we think of that anchor as that maybe a key technical model or a component of it, and the boat is the athlete, when everything's a very, we'll call it a safe environment, then we lengthen that chain and allow a lot more exploration. And we constrain that a little bit if if there's a lot of chaos going on.
Sure.
So you essentially hit the nail on the head with
Yeah.
what you were
Okay.
saying.
Yeah. I like the anchor example for sure. That's awesome. Um, so to kind of switch gears here, and not necessarily switch gears, it's kind of actually there's a nice segue into what we had talked about, talking about the anaerobic speed reserve and some of the things that you're doing at IMG. So obviously I want to give you a chance to kind of talk through some of the things that you're really passionate about and some of the, rabbit holes, if you will, that you're kind of going down now in your time as, having a little bit more autonomy and a little bit more of ownership over what you're doing, some of the things you're really interested in. And obviously anaerobic speed reserve and some, profiling and individualization that might be taking place with you guys at IMG. Maybe if you want to start off in a basic sense, just kind of outlining for the listeners what your definition or thoughts are on anaerobic speed reserve, and maybe kind of get into some of the things that are taking place and how you might be implementing some of these concepts and some of the thoughts and what that looks like for you guys at IMG.
Yeah, for sure. It's been really cool as of late. So when I interned at Altis, World Athletic Center at the time, an individual named Gary Sanford was in that same intern group. Afterwards, he went on and did a ton of great things, including a PhD, and a lot of it centered around anaerobic speed reserve. And I'll be honest, and I think I told him this, I didn't really know what he was doing and what he was working on for quite a while. And it took me a while to get to his thesis and to get to his papers. But once I did, I realized it was really timely as well, because I was starting to do a lot more work with team sport. But it sort of hit me as like a ton of bricks that there was something really effective and valuable within it, particularly for team sport. And then, we can look at soccer and the direction soccer is going with higher speeds and loop that in as well. But so that was kind of where a lot of it started. So I know Gareth extremely well. We talk almost weekly.
Nice.
And he's an expert on the topic, so that certainly helps. And then now we've brought it into IMG. So essentially, we're looking at sort of the relationship between their maximal sprint speed and their maximal aerobic speed. We use for most of the groups at IMG, we use a 6-minute time trial. So we'll just have the athletes run around the track for 6 minutes, and then track their distance, mark their distance on that. And then we'll use a 30-yard sprint test, and I take splits at 20 to 25 and 25 to 30 to determine a max velocity there. It's really an average of that split, but we'll call it a max velocity. So we can look at that range between those two. We can also look at what's called speed reserve ratio. So we take the maximal sprint speed and divide it by the max aerobic speed. And that'll just give us a single number. For the most part, I'll say it's between 1.5 and 2.2. Boils it down to a single number that we can work with quite well. Currently at IMG, we're really diving pretty deep in with tennis. And I think tennis affords us a cool opportunity because we're able to match that speed reserve ratio. So that higher the number, if it's up around 2 to 2.2, it'd be a little bit more suited towards maximal sprint work as opposed to fitness or endurance or conditioning, whatever you want to call it. Sure. The lower number, they're a little bit more well suited on those enduring abilities. Okay. So we can match that with their different game styles. Do they sit on the baseline and have long rallies, or they serve and get up to the net and volley and have really short points? And if so, if that is their game style, then we probably want a pretty high speed reserve ratio. And if they are very defensive players and have long points in tennis, then we probably want a number around 1.6 so that they get a little bit more enduring. So we can match those up, and we can start to have some really cool conversations and some really holistic conversations with the student athletes, with their parents, with their sport coaches around what their strategy is on the court, what we're doing from a physical performance standpoint to outfit them with different tools to be able to execute that strategy, and which ones maybe need to adjust and which ones don't. A lot of different things there. Okay. We're trying to take it a step further as well and look at some different training programs for these different subgroups based on their profiles and see how they adapt to them. Okay. So we're kind of taking a pretty sort of, I could just call it a basic approach, where we've got a group doing what's more in the track and field, where at least a typical long to short program, longer duration, slower intensities, and then progress from there. And one just doing the inverse from that, short to long. And so we've got a few different profiles in each of those groups. And so then in a few weeks, hopefully we'll be able to look at how they're responding to some of that training, and if we see any differences to that adaptation or training response based off their profiles. So still somewhat early stages with some of it, but it's pretty exciting, I think, and it's already proven to be pretty promising. And that's just with tennis, and we're doing it with a lot of the other sports now as well. And it allows us to dial in some of the conditioning, especially.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that's super interesting. I mean, I think anytime you're taking a look at some specific data that you've gathered from the athlete and then communicating that to a coach or a parent on, hey, like, here's what we think would actually be the best in terms of coming up with a strategy for their gameplay and the style of play that they will try to go at when they're on the court or the ice, the field, whatever the case may be. That's really interesting, trying to play to their strengths and then maybe at the same time, touch on and expose them to some of their weaknesses without, kind of pulling back from some of the things that have made them successful and getting to the point where they are at IMG, I'm assuming.
Totally. It gets us a lot more buy-in. I mean, tennis, arguably, especially tennis players want to play tennis, and I don't blame them. It's an awesome sport. But but you look at youth tennis players, which is ultimately what we're dealing with, and they especially just want to play tennis. And it's it's a very skillful sport, so they should be playing a lot of tennis, arguably. Sure. So sometimes it's tough to get them to really buy into conditioning sessions or maximal sprint speed. They're trying to save a little bit, usually for the court. They play a lot of tennis. But once we've been able to have these conversations around why we're doing it and how it can help them and how it connects with their strategies and with their game style, we've seen already the intent and the effort and the buy-in go way up. Just from that. So that's been, if nothing else, it's a win just because of that.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's awesome. Well, okay, let's run back because I feel like we just went through a nice little like trigonometry session or whatever. So the brain's a little scrambled. So just to give a kind of a regroup here, sort of like a reset. So we're taking a look at max sprint speed and max aerobic speed. Right? In order to find the max aerobic speed, you're talking about a 6-minute run around the track. And that's where you're going to figure out just in terms of like total distance covered during that 6 minutes.
Yeah. So we'll take the distance covered in meters. If it is 6 minutes, in fact, then we'll divide that distance by 360 for the seconds. And then we can get a meters per second as the max aerobic speed. Ultimately, looking for somewhere between a 5 and 7 minute mark. And so it's hard on a bigger group to say that that's going to be 1,200 meters or that's going to be 2K. 2K would be great, but I also typically will keep them under 1,600 meters. I try to keep them under a mile. If I'm not doing the time trial, if we're just doing a set distance, knowing some athletes are going to fall outside of that 5 to 7 minute window, but also knowing that there's a lot of youth athletes kind of grow up being told to just go run a mile. Sure. And to practice the conditioning, go run a mile. And so, there's kind of a mental block sometimes around running a mile.
Yeah.
Probably some, not to make light of PTSD, but some type of PTSD of some bad experiences, with some non-intentional coaching there. And so I think, for those times where we have a really big group and it's hard to just do a time trial, then I usually try to go 1,400 meters just so I can tell them that it's under a mile. And all of a sudden there's kind of a sigh of relief. But
so you will have a set distance sometimes?
Yeah, we've done that as well. The bigger groups, it's usually a little bit easier to do that set distance, so you can just time them from the start and finish line, call out their time as they run through, and then they can report it back to you. Okay.
And then you're also tracking a 30-yard sprint in which you're taking the distance from the 20 to the 25-yard marker and the 25 to the 30-yard marker. The average of the two will give you that max velocity that you're looking for.
Sorry, so close. So I'm looking at both of them separately. Okay. Because each athlete's going to hit their top speed at a slightly different spot. And what I've seen so far is that it's been a pretty equal split between who has the fastest split between 20 and 25 and whose fastest split is 25 and 30.
Oh, wow.
So, I think the most common practice is just to do a 10-yard split and get a max velocity from that. But my hope is to just be a little bit more specific with it by bringing it down. It certainly is more specific by bringing it down to a 5-yard split. And calculating from that. So then whichever split is fastest, that'll be their maximal sprint speed.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's awesome. And then in order to find the speed reserve ratio, which is then what you kind of get into when you're starting to individualize and profile some of these athletes, you're going to take a look at that sprint time, or the 20 to 25, essentially the 20 to the 30, depending on which one you go with, which 5-yard split you go with, and you're going to divide that by the max aerobic speed that you've come up with.
Yep. So I take that split time and just convert that into meters per second. So say they get 8 meters per second as their max sprint speed, and then 4 meters per second as their max aerobic speed. 8 divided by 4, then their speed reserve ratio is 2.
Okay. And then once you have that number, that's when, and obviously you talked about specifically with tennis, then you not only do you use that number to try to come up with specific strategies, but also when it comes to the way that you outline their preparation, that's when you may decide, okay, this athlete could use a little bit more of a long to short strategy. This athlete can use a little bit more of a short to long strategy. Are there other, and then obviously, like I said, the initial stages of trying to maybe communicate to the coach, hey, like, this is the athlete's strengths here. Here are some of their weaknesses. Here are some of the things that we should be doing on the court in order to help them, improve their sport outcomes. Are there any other like factors then you get into as far as that individualization, that profile? Are there other things that you guys are looking at that help kind of guide, those numbers help guide?
Yeah, I'd say the big one, and it comes handy quite a bit because their competition schedule, individual sport, it's all over the place, and it stretches almost the entire calendar year.
Yeah.
And so one thing that we would often talk about at Altis is strengths and weaknesses of an athlete, and moving them more towards their strengths, relatively more towards their strengths during a competitive season. And so I'm kind of bringing that same mindset. So say an athlete has a competition, an important competition in 4 weeks, and they're more of a speed profile as opposed to endurance, then I'm going to have them doing a little bit more speed work closer to that competition and more of that endurance work further away. So if we got a 4-week block leading into a big competition, that athlete's going to go, we'll call it a long to short, but they might do, say we have 8 training sessions, they might do 30-second runs for the first 2 and then 25-second, and just bringing that down and bringing that intensity up a little bit from there, with the idea being that they'll be more comfortable doing the work that they're better at closer to that competition. And so that's kind of how I've set it up for this semester, sort of as this first little mini experiment. I think a lot of times we would have a tendency to go right after their weaknesses, but we started soon after Christmas break, and some of them are smack in the middle of their competitive season. So I started everybody with their strength.
Sure.
If you were a speed profile, we're going to start doing speed work, and we're going to gradually take that out. With my hope and my thought being that we're not going to negatively interfere with what's going on the tennis courts, and hoping that we can just gradually shift them to improve upon whatever side their weakness is.
Sure.
But that's still up for debate. Now we'll retest them here in a couple of weeks, and we'll see if that has in fact happened. And maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But
will you use the same protocols to test? I'm assuming the retest. Okay.
Yep.
And just so that everybody knows, Gary Sanford, is that correct? Is that
Gareth? Yeah, Gareth. Gareth. Sanford. A lot of great stuff on Twitter. I'm not sure what his Twitter handle is, but a lot of good material out.
Yeah. Well, I'm assuming it would be difficult to get a hold of his thesis. Does he have a ton of work on anaerobic speed reserve that a bunch of the listeners could probably check out and at least see some of this stuff? Like, I'm taking notes, obviously, but is there at least see some of this stuff on paper and be able to kind of actualize what they're hearing?
Yeah, for sure. His ResearchGate page would be the best one. I've got a short, maybe 3-minute video on YouTube, just kind of outlining what aerobic speed reserve is. And then him and I have recorded a couple conversations similar to this on the topic. We did one with a guy named Phil Scott, who's I believe he's the head S&C for England Cricket, who's also doing it in a similar way with the profiling. So there's a conversation out there with the 3 of us as well. So I really don't mean that as a plug for some of that stuff really, but since we've gone pretty deep into it, I know it can be hard to maybe conceptualize, and I talk kind of fast. So some of those videos have some graphics and stuff that might help with it.
Yeah, no, and that's the idea. And obviously, I'm going to give you a chance at the end. Like, I want to make sure that you get to actually plug like all of the work that you've done. Like, I was trying to, filter through some of the stuff last night and everything, but it's like, yeah, let's give you a chance to obviously do that. And if you have a 3 minute, clip on YouTube that's explaining some of the stuff, like that's what we want out there. Like, I want people to be able to have access to that so they can see and understand. So speaking of that, like obviously building off of some of the work that you've done. And obviously, I'm assuming, as you're only 31 years old, like as you continue to grow, you're probably going to have more work and more content out there. But some of the work that you've done on obviously the feedback from, through motor learning, right? Like I think that's something that I've actually heard you talk about before. I know obviously we met when we were doing the sort of like high performance happy hours or whatever. And I think that was part kind of like, kind of dive into that a little bit there. But if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to get into some of that stuff as well, just because I think you'll probably touch on some little nuggets of like how we can actually approach some of this coaching dialogue and some of the ways that we're communicating with athletes and some of the ways that we actually take a look at feedback. So yeah, if you wouldn't mind getting into some of the role of feedback during motor learning, that would kind of feed into some of the other stuff, and we can, plug some of your other stuff out there as well so people can have access to it.
Yeah, I think the idea of feedback, I think is bigger than we usually give it credit for. I think we often use it synonymously with communication or verbal communication, I should say, and
Sure.
probably more specifically cueing. But there's sensory feedback. There's the auditory feedback. There's a lot of forms of feedback, and I think when we're, as athletes or as humans, when we're learning a skill, the feedback is critical. And it was Nikolai Bernstein who first, arguably, it's probably debatable, but some would say at least is one of the first to really highlight the need for feedback within that. And then obviously he went his whole route and did all the work that he's done, which is fantastic. But I'd say it's just a really big concept, and it's a concept and a topic and an idea that, in my mind, underpins what we do as coaches. Just as much, if not more so, than periodization or general adaptation syndrome, or maybe some of these other topic areas that we typically, excuse me, know more about or spend more time discussing and learning, as opposed to just general feedback.
Sure.
So I like to look at feedback kind of almost across an athlete's lifespan is not the right term, but as they're learning a skill, across kind of that journey as they learn a skill. And how the feedback will adjust throughout that. And so, if we're talking about frequency of feedback, and that's probably more of that verbal feedback, as an athlete's learning a new skill, that frequency is going to be pretty high. Once they get a certain level of competence through that, maybe a few weeks, maybe a few months, it may just be a couple of sessions, then I think we're better off if we dial back some of that frequency of feedback and really start to incorporate more constraint-based learning into that. And then, if we look at a sprinter going into a competitive season, we look at a pre-meet training session. We usually want to be pretty short and sharp, pretty effective and efficient, get them in, get them out. And so probably more towards that high frequency of feedback again, so that they know after the rep whether it went well or not. And usually it almost always goes well if it's right before a competition, because we don't need that mindset.
Yeah.
But so just sort of periodizing our feedback a little bit. And I think the same goes for, if we operate as coach as facilitator versus a coach as a director. We may be a little bit more directive and prescriptive early on with our feedback and with our practice organization as an athlete's learning a new skill, through kind of this middle phase as they have some level of competence with it. Then maybe we are a little bit more facilitative, so more freedom around that anchor point to explore. And then maybe we tighten that up again as we get into a competitive season. And I think there's a lot of different, really it's just called the microstructure components of practice. So cues versus constraints, blocked versus random practice. I mentioned a couple: high frequency, low frequency feedback, coach's facilitator, coach's director, kind environments versus wicked environments. I think David Epstein was one to highlight sort of those definitions. And so that middle phase, when they have some level of competence with that skill, say it's sprinting, then we will impose a much more wicked environment. So a little bit more chaotic, more of that random practice organization. Whereas when they're learning it, we want a pretty kind environment so they can just kind of get their feet underneath them, so to speak. So there's a lot there, and I'm probably missing a lot of different sort of subtopics of feedback they could fall into that. But hopefully that kind of paints a picture of my thoughts around it, and how I think it's a huge topic that really branches out and underpins a lot of what we do.
Yeah, definitely. No, and just to go back, what was the microstructure term that you?
Microstructure components to practice. So, I would just say that I'd define that kind of as all the variables of practice that usually fly under the radar. So throw out sets, reps, volume, intensity, and think about anything else that comes into that. So the types of feedback, the frequency, again, how we structure it, how we organize the exercises together, the drills, whatever it may be.
Okay. Yeah. And then obviously putting that into practice, you talked about, maybe in the early stages, and I guess kind of moving into like team sport a little bit more, because now we're talking, I'm always thinking in terms of like practice structure. I like getting, I'm thinking about a way that I could communicate this to a sport coach, saying like, hey, in the early phases of our, off season, or maybe it's even in the early phases of our in season, right? Like if you're trying to develop and implement new skills, obviously you're, like you said, you're going to have a little bit more of a kind environment, one that's obviously a little bit more rigid. We're kind of, it's nice, like we're queuing them up. They're allowed to obviously respond to some of the feedback that we're giving them. They're in a situation where there's a little bit less chaos. There's much more order of everything that's taking place in front of them. And then obviously maybe towards the middle part of that season, once they've actually gained some of the skill that you believe, or that you've, hopefully developed it within them, and they've gotten some of the basics down, that foundation down, now you can start to provide some a little bit more chaos, right? So I believe you got a wicked environment. Is that kind of the way you described it? So now that you have that, now you're kind of like, okay, we expose them to this, and then obviously their body's going to try to have to figure out a way to make order of that chaos as well, right, in order to kind of go through and adapt to that skill. And then as you're phasing out of that, maybe you're phasing into an actual competition season. Is that where you would kind of move into a little bit more of this facilitator role, where you're backing off? There's less cueing, there's less feedback, there's just more so execution, not necessarily in a chaotic or a wicked environment in any set. It's just more so making sure that they understand the specific tasks that need to get done. Not trying to necessarily stimulate, just more so like expose and create some sort of like task specific resilience. Is that kind of a good way to?
Yeah, I'd say that's really accurate. I think a big part of that, it's all about the competition,
right?
Team sport, individuals, competition is everything. So as much as we can safeguard that, so as much as we can understand how the athletes are responding to these different styles of coaching, through these different phases of them learning a skill or their training and their practice, then I think we need to rely on that more so, kind of that anecdotal experience of what has been working and what hasn't, as we get into that competition period. Because, as much as I just laid out a lot of different kind of framework, there's also a lot of nuance to that. My time with the Chinese national sprint team, as much as I would probably opt for lower frequency of feedback, probably more creative external cues through sort of this middle phase of they've got a good level of competence, but we're still trying to dial things in. It just simply didn't work with that population. Now, again, it could have been me, and maybe I just need to do a better job of executing that. But I also think that there's a big cultural component to that, and just the way things have been done for them in the past. Sure. And so they really crave feedback after every rep, and you can try to be fancy and creative with an external cue, and again, you'll be met with blank stares typically, and they just want to know precisely and exactly what they should be doing. Usually from an internal cueing type standpoint. And so just as one example where a lot of the nice, neat, orderly framework can quickly go out the window. And that's why for the competitive season, I think if we can really pay attention to how they've been responding to these different adjustments in the microstructure components, then we can dial in and sort of cater to them, meet them where they're at for that competition period.
Yeah. When you were over there, was there, I mean, I'm assuming did a lot of them speak English at all, or was it tough? Like, is that a part of the?
Yeah, it was tough. Most didn't. A couple did a little bit. I had an assistant who was a translator as well. Okay. And so that was helpful, but there's a lot of words that there's no direct translation. Yeah, especially when you start thinking about coach lingo and some of these things. So it was really you really end up relying a lot on the translator to try to morph what you're trying to say into the language that works and that fits.
That's got to be so challenging.
It's an awesome challenge, and I'd say it, it was a great group. It was a phenomenal experience for so many ways. And I was fortunate prior to that experience to have some experience with international athletes that language was a big barrier. Yeah. So it didn't come as a complete shock to me at that point. And I think things went quite well. And there were some other American coaches that were part of the group, lead sprint coach and different things that were great to help kind of onboard me to what that environment was going to be like.
Yeah. What do you have exposure to speaking other languages, or is like, I mean, specifically?
No, not really. I mean, yeah, just kind of standard Spanish that we might learn growing up, but a lot of that has gone. I got a lot of buy-in because I made a very strong effort to learn Mandarin when I was with them, and I was enjoying it too. I'm still kicking myself for letting it fall off. That came to an end due to COVID. Right. They went back. We were in LA. They went back to China and couldn't bring me. Didn't want the hassle. I don't think it was even possible if they wanted to bring me, based off the restrictions. Sure. And so it came to kind of abrupt end, and I was really bummed because I was enjoying it. It was going to be leading into Tokyo and everything. And so I stepped away from learning the language for a few weeks, and then all of it just gone. I mean, it's tough anyways, but really got to stick with it. So a lot of it has slipped through now.
That's really interesting. Yeah, it's got to be super challenging. I think it's one of those that, like, my mom and her family are from Italy, so my brother is kind of taking it on himself. He wants to learn to be able to speak Italian pretty fluently, and he's gotten it down now to where, like, he has like bandwidth between like he has like range. Like if he's like trying to communicate something one way and like grandma's not getting it, like he can go another route and get it. Whereas like I think that's probably what you were challenged with. Like you might be able to have like certain like words, right? And then it's like, all right, well now I need to like form these words into a sentence. And then it's like, okay, maybe I'm able to put together the words needed to communicate to this athlete like what I'm looking for. But obviously, if you look at the way that we communicate, I mean, just listen to this conversation in general, there's so much range between like how I've tried to explain my thoughts on certain things and the way that you tried to explain your thoughts on certain things. And if you don't have those when you're trying to communicate a completely different language, and let's be honest, I mean, I know we're talking athletics, like the things that these guys are trying to execute at their level, it's probably some pretty complex conversations that you need to have. There's probably some intricate thoughts that you're trying to articulate to these guys. So, male and female. So I would imagine that's probably, like how it's like, you don't have, like, it's so difficult when you don't have like and I come across it all the time with my family. It's like, I'm trying to like say one thing. I'm like, what's the best way that I can like describe this? And it's like, you get the point across, but it's like, do they truly understand what it is that you were trying to say? Like understand or do they just know, like, did you just give them like something that was similar to like yes or no based off of what their question was? You know what I mean? It's like, that's not really like the type of feedback you're looking for. It's just like, all right, they know what you're saying, but like they don't understand. You know what I mean? I think that's got to be super challenging when you're working in an athletic environment.
Yeah, certainly. You end up relying a lot more on demonstrations and the translators and some other people around, but you just figure out a way to get it done.
Yeah, I think learning language is one of those skills. Like you said, if you don't touch on it for a couple of weeks, it's like it just starts to fade, and it becomes frustrating after a while too. Well, that's awesome though. I mean, at least you were able to have that experience. Unfortunately, COVID cut it short, but I would imagine, I'm assuming you have athletes at IMG who come from all over the place too, so you get some exposure to like different people who speak different languages and different cultures and stuff like that, which is pretty cool. I always think like, a place like IMG, like they're providing people with an experience, like an opportunity to, break down barriers and obviously understand more about each other. So that's probably the unique piece about a place like IMG.
Totally. And Altis was similar, from the coach programs to the athlete group. I think in the 2016 Olympics, we had athletes who represented over 20 different countries. And I grew up in a small town, mid-Michigan. So it was really great to have that Altis experience and meet people from all over the world. And it really opened my eyes to a lot of different stuff. So and IMG fits that mold just as much as Altis did. So it's pretty neat.
That's awesome. Well, we're coming up pretty close to an hour now, and I want to be conscious of your time because I know you got stuff to take care of. But I do want to ask you the one question. I think this is a question that you actually posed in our high performance happy hour, where it was like, I'm not going to say it verbatim, but it was like, if someone told you that you needed to go execute like one of the most difficult things that you needed to do in your life, I think I'm in the ballpark, right? Like who, but like, but they didn't give you the details on like what that task was or like how it needed to get done or like what any details on the specific situation at all. And you had to choose one person to come with you and help you with that. Who would you choose? I gotta start like implementing that in the end of these podcasts and just like say it's a great question. I remember I chose my dad because the dude just like knows everything, but like, yeah, who would be your go-to, your choice if someone told you, hey, you're about to go on a journey and execute some of the most difficult things that you've ever done, but I'm not going to give you any details on what that specific task would be, who are you taking with you?
Yeah, it's I do enjoy asking. I feel like you can get to know a lot about a person potentially with this one.
Yeah.
And fortunately, yeah, since you got it from me and I stole it from somebody else, it's one that I've given some thought to over the last year or two, and it always comes back to my brother. I've got a twin brother, and we work in totally different fields. He's more kind of home improvement, energy efficiency with houses and stuff like that. But I'd say, we've gone through a lot of trials and tribulations. We used to fight a lot growing up. There was years where we wouldn't hang out and really talk a lot, and especially now we're best of friends and talk all the time. I just met him in Tennessee a few weekends ago because it was right in between both of us. I think him and I would just figure out a way to figure it out. I think we're both pretty passionate individuals. We don't like to fail. So if it's an important task and I don't know anything about it, I think him and I would work pretty together on it.
He's the guy. Yeah, it's those home improvement guys. They never seem to fail. Like they always figure out. They know everything about how everything works. They can take it apart and put it back together. And yeah, that's definitely somebody that you would want, like a jack of all trades going on any sort of. That's good though. I'm glad to hear that you and your brother are close. I'm the oldest of 5 boys, so me and my brothers are very close. Like it's I consider them my best friends. So and there's definitely been definitely some times growing up where it's like, especially being the oldest, it's like there's like this unwritten rule. It's like, hey man, like, make sure you always have your shit together because like you're kind of the leader of this thing, so like make sure you're locked in, even when you like, you might be going through some stuff where it doesn't matter, like figure it out, make it be the rock. So I think that's always been enjoyable. And it's good when you get a chance to actually, kind of like look back. We watch like home videos all the time and I'm just like, man, what were we thinking though? We were so like, kids are so mean. Like we're so mean when we're kids, like teenage kids. Like why were we like, there's like one video where we're like on like a trip to Florida or whatever. And me and the second oldest brother, like we thought we were super cool because it was our first time skimboarding or whatever. And like we wouldn't let our middle brother borrow the skimboard at all, have any ride. We wouldn't even like talk to him or whatever. Like why would we doing that? Why would like we couldn't just let him go on one ride? So
it's hard to justify those actions nowadays.
Yeah, exactly. You're so embarrassed and you're like, we're humans, we're also flawed. But all right, well, before we go, I do want to give you a chance. All the work that you have, like social media, like let people know like where they can contact you or just look up your stuff, find your work. Any other plugs as far as, like you said, like the 3-minute video on YouTube, your work on feedback with motor learning, any podcasts, anything else that you want people to know about, where they can find you, and obviously some of the great work that you've done. Let us know.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's kind of, I'd say there's probably a handful of stuff out there, but it's sort of all over the place. And I'm kind of sporadic on social media and stuff. I couldn't even tell you what my handles are, but I'm sure that they're easy enough to find. I've written a few articles for Simply Faster. There's a lot of stuff on the Altis website and the Altis YouTube. I've got a YouTube channel. I think it's just my name, Jason Hettler.
Nice.
I've got a website, Hettler Performance, but I really don't do a lot with that. I keep telling myself that I'm going to do more. And then,
I was on that last night. I'm like, man, like if he kept this thing going or whatever, I could see definitely getting some serious subscribers, be some good content on there. It looks pretty cool.
I appreciate it. The last year, it's been so much of just figuring out this new environment. IMG is quite a place with a lot going on. Yeah. And I feel like now I've got a handle on it, and I'll tell you, I've grown so much as a coach in the last year, just being in a new environment with a new population. And so I want to spend some more time in my own head and solidify some of those thoughts and some of that growth and hopefully put that on paper and share it if anybody's interested. So Yeah, this next year I'll be making an effort to do a bit more of that, but we'll see. As you mentioned, I got kid number one coming any day now.
So. Right. Yes.
It's all up in the air.
Forgot about that. That's going to have to come first. Yeah. So,
certainly.
Right. Well, just I looked it up. So you're the Instagram, if people want to go follow you on Instagram, it's J Hettler, Hettler 24. Just J Hettler 24. Simple, straight to the point. No BS. So yeah,
appreciate that.
Yeah, no doubt. Seriously though, Jason, I appreciate you doing this. This has been a blast. I hope everybody listening has obviously learned a ton. I know I have. I got a whole 2 pages of notes here, and I'll definitely be hitting you up with some questions after we go check out some of the other stuff that you've put out there on Aerobic Speed Reserve. But yeah, thank you again. And maybe we'll do a part 2, maybe sometime, later down the road after you've, gotten settled in and your son or daughter has grown up a little bit and you get a little bit more time. But yeah, again, thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you, man. Enjoy the conversation.
Absolutely.
Talk to you soon.
All right. Sounds good. We'll talk to you. Bye, everybody.